All right, so continuing on, yep, in Terry Eagleton's Ideology, now we're in chapter six, from Schopenhauer to Sorel. Bunch of stuff again going on in this chapter. I'm only hitting the highlights. So let's, before we dive into Schopenhauer though, and before we ask the question of, okay, it seems like Eagleton has kind of gone back in time. Like the previous chapter, he's already in previous chapters, he's talked about 20th century thinkers. Now we're going back to Schopenhauer. What's going on here? I'm not sure why exactly he organized the book this way. I think it might have been a little easier if it had been a little bit more of a linear fashion, but nonetheless, who am I to quibble about the organization of the book? But I think what's important here that Eagleton picks up on is the notion of an irrationalist kind of tradition, and there is one in Western philosophy, and it doesn't begin, like with Nietzsche or Schopenhauer. Eagleton says it begins with Schopenhauer, but I don't think it does. And I think also we're going to be careful about the term irrationalism, what we mean by it. But let's just kind of start off. And Eagleton does mention, that there is a kind of, a reaction to overuse of reason and putting reason in its place. In other words, reason does have a place. It's not necessarily something that's always in command, and nor should it be. In other words, the eloquent expression of this comes from the great thinker David Hume. Now, Hume is an extremely important figure in the history of Western philosophy. Love him, hate him, not know him, you should deal with him. You should read his materials. You should think about it. Hume is an extremely influential thinker. As a matter of fact, there's the nice little story that we often, philosophy teachers like myself, and I heard it too, that, it was because of Hume that Kant claims to have awoken from his dogmatic slumbers, and he's like, I got to deal with this Hume guy. Well, what was Kant worried about? Why did Hume, supposedly, just for the sake of discussion, why did Hume's philosophy upset Kant? Well, Hume's philosophy upset a lot of people because in many ways he arguably dethroned reason. He made reason seem something that was much less powerful, much less a part of our lives. Now, Aristotle, too, although he said, reason should be in control, he did roll emotions and passions up with reason in his ethical theory. Because Aristotle was by no means like a Stoic. It was like, oh, you got to get rid of the emotions and just live like kind of like a Vulcan stoicist, Mr. Spock, just according to pure reason and all that. Kant wasn't quite like that either, but Kant was very much in the camp of, pure reason has a big job to do and it's got to settle all the things about knowledge. Hume says something like this: reason is, so he's not just is, but ought to be the slave of the passions. So it's not just simply, Hume's not just simply asserting, you know what, we might like it. Wouldn't it be great if reason were in control? But we're not. We're just too emotional. He's not even saying that. He's saying we're not really reasoning creatures, and it's a good thing that the passions are in control, and it should be the case that they're in control. Now, why would he say something like that? Well, it depends on what you see and think about the notion of reason. So always be careful when people say, oh, well, that stands to reason, or reason dictates, or whatever. Always ask yourself, what do the people mean by reason here? Well, let's look at Hume. For Hume, reason is a kind of neutral instrument. It's like it's like a process of calculation. It's a tool, right? It's like a calculator is a reasoning instrument. It can weigh things, it can do things, but it doesn't have goals. In other words, if you think of reason as a neutral instrument, like a tool, something that calculates, it can get you to the goal, but it doesn't tell you what the goal should be. Kind of like that sort of simplistic notion, but not entirely inaccurate, of, something like science and calculating and all that stuff, that will tell you that through your reasoning through science, it will tell you how to make all kinds of things. It will tell you how to make medicines that help people. It will also tell you how to make poisons that kill people. It will tell you how to make bridges and all kinds of things that humans can drive over and all that stuff. It will also tell you how to destroy those bridges. So, well, how do you know what to do? Well, that's not a decision of calculation. Although some people try to argue that it is, but I think it's kind of a long shot, and they're usually slipping in notions of non-calculative notions in order to get sort of like, oh, this pure reason will get you to goals and not merely a means. But for Hume, he's basically saying, oh, you know what? It's just kind of a calculator sort of thing, and it gets you means, but it doesn't get you ends. And then he says kind of things like, reason is completely indifferent whether it's the destruction of the human race or my little finger, something like that. He said reason just would just simply state the difference, right? And maybe the consequences of that, but not really anything more than that. Moral judgments and stuff, those are part of the passions. And think about it. Think about when your professor says to you, oh, you got an essay due at the end of the session. And you know that. That's a cognitive state you're in. Okay, I know that in 3 months or whatever now, number of weeks or months, I have a paper that's due. What usually motivates us? It's not necessarily the cognitive thing. It is kind of the passionate thing where you start going, oh boy, I'd better get that done. And you feel that sense of nervousness. Reason doesn't get you out of bed in the morning. Your passions do. That's the line that Hume is trying to argue. So reason is and ought to be. And if we didn't have reason as a slave of the passions, we might not do anything, right? So we are passionate creatures, and that's a good thing. Passions get us around, and reason helps us how to get and achieve our goals. However, as Eagleton points out, that it's a quick step from this neutral instrument of reason to reason as not just an instrument of the passions. Maybe reason is kind of one of the passions, or a reflex to the passions, right? Or maybe reason is just a mode, like a species of the passions, So reason is just a particular kind of passion that maybe we have glorified in a certain way or looked at differently or whatever. But it's really not intrinsically different than other passions, right? Again, the emphasis on reason is a species of the passions. That's not Hume, but that's a quick move, right? Once you sort of dethrone reason, it doesn't have to be shoved into the camp of the passions, but you can see why. Well, people might think like, well, if it's not doing all that, maybe it's just another passion, and we've glorified it. So reason then becomes, it's a quick step to a species of the passions. It's not a route to truth and knowledge, right? And even some medieval philosophers thought that your reason would be a route to truth. So you like Nicholas of Cusa thought that things like, well, if you understand and you reason your way through mathematics, so some simple proposition like 1 + 1 = 2, the knowledge and the connection that you have through reason to a proposition like that, God doesn't know that any better than you do. If you truly understand and reason your way to 1 + 1 = 2, you have kind of an experience that connects you to the divine. Like reason is incredibly powerful. So you know mathematical truths the way God does. He may know a lot more, but he doesn't know 1 + 1 = 2 any better than you do. So that's pretty lofty stuff that reason was thought to do. But now, once it's dethroned, it becomes a reflex. Oh my goodness, it's a species. Now it's just some mental state. It's just consciousness. Oh yeah, reason is just consciousness. It's just desires and action. It's shot through with interests, right? It's nothing, lofty and all that. It's an accidental product of evolution, right, and all that. So it's really lost its big status. So it becomes reason then, with the little r here, becomes ideological in two ways. That reason now, because it's not a root, it's lost all that, it's a mode, blah, blah, blah. It's just a particular way of expressing interests, right? So it's kind of this, you can see what we're leading to. Oh, this reason is just kind of a way to trick people to hide your interest. Yeah, that's the second one. It's a particular way of expressing interest. It's a mask of impartiality. That's what reason really is. It's a kind of mask. as sort of and we've seen this before, kind of this universalism, this particularism that disguises itself as universal, and even more pernicious is it's not only disguising itself as universal, it disguises itself as natural, right? Okay, so interests then are hiding in this consciousness, and reason is just this sort of mask that interests can hide. So it's got this heavy ideological sense. Now, for Eagleton, in his story here, and we're working our way to Schopenhauer, Hegel, the great German idealist thinker, he's also reacting indirectly to Hume, more directly to Kant, and he wants an even more robust notion of reason. Now, Hegel's a tricky one to talk about, and the line that I'm going to give you about Hegel is orthodox according to some groups of scholars and not so orthodox. But I'm reading Hegel in the full-blooded metaphysical sense that he thought reason was really going to tell us about the nature of reality, not just how we think about reality, which is more Kant, but no, Hegel is like reason is really in the world. It's part of us. And his famous expression, the real is the rational is the real. And that reason is something that moves through history, through time, in us. And he sometimes calls it the idea of reason, eventually working its way up to the absolute. But the point is that it's that thing I talked about in a previous video of this positive dialectics. Everything becoming worked up in thought, and even more so is that all of reality is ultimately this kind of harmonious, rational whole. Hence the heavy metaphysical dimension of it. Well, Eagleton says that's kind of the last gasp. What's going on? Well, he says, in his story, he says, Schopenhauer comes in, who's not quite, really isn't, well, he did try and schedule, from what I read, is that he tried to schedule his lectures opposite those of Hegel's, and it didn't go that well. Hegel was much more popular, so Schopenhauer wasn't very happy about that. Anyways, that's just a little anecdote. But Schopenhauer was reacting to Hegel. Many thinkers were. The great philosopher, the religious kind of Christian religious thinker, the Danish thinker, Søren Kierkegaard, also was reacting to Hegel, who we thought was stripping the universe of its life energy and forces and blood and turning it into these bloodless rational categories. Arthur Schopenhauer kind of takes this idea of reason in the absolute as working through the world, and he reconceives it and talks about it in terms of the will, right? This blind, overwhelming, self-perpetuating force that sort of drives up the whole universe. Everything is this blind will or force. It's a primal, blind, self-perpetuating force which lies at the foundation of the world. And that's, for Schopenhauer, that's the will. And then the will, not surprisingly, this general kind of will writ large, breeds in us sort of like the little will. So I just have that with a small w. So the capital W for the big force will, and then the little will, the intellect, right? We sometimes call it the intellect. And in that sense, what we've got is, that's our reason, that's our rationality. All kinds of things are in the intellect. But what is the sort of ideological angle here for Schopenhauer? Well, if it's ideological in the sense that now it's just a particular way of expressing interest, like through the will in the general sense, or the particular way of expressing interest through the tiny will in the particular sense, what happens to the notion of Schopenhauer's writing itself and any kind of reflection that's on this kind of upper level about talking the way the world is? And he says, well, if Schopenhauer's writings are like from the little will and the intellect, are they delusional? Are they themselves just ideological in some ways, or just a particular way of expressing a particular interest? There's nothing really objective or whatever about it. Or is it from the big will? Should we interpret it that way, that it's just this blind self-perpetuation? Again, it's just an expression of the will. There's nothing really true or anything about it, because, again, there's no sort of distance between consciousness and reality. That's all overcome. Everything's just an expression of this big blind will perpetuating itself. And so Eagleton says, like, are we here with Schopenhauer being caught in this kind of, and I just sort of squeezed this in the corner here, where, that old story, if you say something like, nothing is true, right? All statements are false and no such thing as a true statement. And I label that as Q. So Q stands for nothing is true. Well, is Q part of that nothing? Does that nothing refer to Q? Is that self-referential? And it goes back to antiquity that, not necessarily that all self-referential propositions, propositions that refer to themselves are intrinsically problematic. No, some aren't. But a lot are, especially when they assert certain things that if they fall under, you generate a paradox, right? So if nothing is true, is Q true or not? And that's why logicians in the 20th century tried to design levels and, type theories of types and all kinds of things to get around these paradoxes that are generated when you say nothing is true, and then you say, well, is Q true? Well, if it's true, then then something is going to be false, and if it's false, then it's true. You can derive contradictions. Are we in a similar pattern with this? Like, are we saying it's true, or if it is, and do we get contradictions out of the deal? Anyways, Eagleton doesn't go a lot into this type of criticism, but I'm assuming that's kind of the angle that he's looking at. Now, this chapter then it just deals a little bit kind of with Schopenhauer. The next main figure is going to be Nietzsche, and since I filled up the board, that'll have to be in the next video. See you then.